awesome show tonight, and I am so grateful to be here for all of you, and I appreciate it so much that you've come along for the ride for this past 2.5 years. My name is Tom Russell. I'm your host for Life Without Limits, and it's going to be a very interesting show, and it kind of hits close to home. And I understand the subject matter a little bit, but not like my guest for tonight. But before we start with my guest, Julie Sanford, just a little bit, unpack a little bit about my show and how to find out where to connect with it. You can go to lifewithoutlimitsshow.com and you'll be able to access all the different things I have on there, including my 2 books. Finding True North, A Bully Teen's Journey of Hope, and Nowhere Man. And if you're interested in looking at or watching several of my YouTube videos from all of my shows, or most of my shows, you can go and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And that's off my website again for lifewithoutlimitsshow.com. And as I always try to remember that I'm not doing this show for me, and I'm doing it for all of you who are out there. I'm really interested to find out what you guys think and how my guests are impacting you. So don't hesitate to ask questions, and hopefully we can help you if you have questions that are really important that you're going through, and then my guest Julie will help you out as much as possible. So let's go ahead and start the show tonight. We all hear stories, people who have struggled with alcohol abuse, and some beat the demons, and some fail miserably over and over again. And we as outsiders, I think, we watch how that person spirals into this demoralizing state of mind, and they struggle to deal with it. And we want to say something to that person. And we want to do something to make that person stop drinking into oblivion. And I think, but the most times we get frustrated. There's a lot of times there's nothing we can do. And you've always heard the phrase, you can't push a rope. Well, you just can't push a rope sometimes. I think, in fact, so many of those people who are witness to a loved one who abuses alcohol, a lot of them just stay silent because they're afraid of not getting through to that person. And that's the worst kind of situation to be in because it's a personal hell for both parties involved. And I think it seems the more we say or do, the more person that they defy your wishes, and the relationship suffers. But tonight, I'm going to let people know that there's hope. Right. You may not think that hope could never be achieved. There are always ways to handle a relationship with someone who drinks too much. Now, again, I'm the last person who's going to offer advice because, number one, I don't drink. And number two, I haven't been in relationship with someone who drinks. But I do have a person close to me who is an alcoholic. And I struggle a lot with trying to help, but not put in a position where it gets to ruin our relationship. And it's a tough place to be. And so that's why I've invited my next guest, Julie Sanford. She's married to a person who has abused alcohol. But what's really cool about Julie and her family is that she's prevailed. And in fact, she hosts her own wildly popular and helpful podcast. It's called Married to Addiction, where she offers her sage advice to those who are struggling. And I have listened to every one but one of her podcast episodes, and I've learned so much about what's going on. So, Julie, without further ado, I want to thank you for coming on my show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for listening. I was really happy to hear that you tuned in and checked it out. So thank you for that as well.
Well, it's important to know my guests. I can't just make up questions and try to figure out where we want to go with the conversation. So I think this really helped out. So let's jump into this because you've been married 13 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be 13 years this fall.
When it comes to alcohol, what were your views about drinking alcohol back then?
So when we first got together, we would drink socially, just like a lot of couples do. It was just, as far as I was concerned, normal. We would go out on the weekends or whatever and have some drinks. So I wasn't completely opposed to drinking. It wasn't something that, was against my personal beliefs or anything, but ended up being something very different, as we're going to talk about.
Hmm. Now, at some point, the alcohol consumption, it changed for your husband. What was occurring then? I mean, why did he start to decide that he wanted to drink more than normal?
So I kind of realized that there was a problem after he lost his dad. That really seemed to be kind of like the turning point where it went from being something that was just like a social occasional thing to something that was more insidious and that started affecting his life and then ultimately our lives. And that was really kind of the time where I can remember where things just started going downhill, where I started thinking to myself, is this still normal amount or is this a little bit excessive? So that is in my memory kind of when things started to change.
Well, it's got to be difficult when you're in the middle of it, because I think that you can't like you said, you can't differentiate how much is too much.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, when you witness this and you see the alcohol abuse, why was it so difficult for you to deal with?
Well, right then, when things started to change, it was difficult because I started really noticing that it felt like my husband wasn't around as much, and it was like this different person. Because obviously, your personality is very different, and the way that you handle things are very different when you've been drinking excessively. So it started kind of with that, where I would notice that, I felt a little bit lonely because I didn't really have him around as much as normal. And it progressed eventually to where I was having to take up a lot of the responsibility around the house and just really, in the parenting role and all of that. And so that's when it kind of started affecting all of those things, is when I really realized that we had a significant problem on our hands.
Now, did your husband know he had a drinking problem, or did he just think that was just a part of the way that the marriage should go at that point?
At first, he didn't. For the first several months, I would say maybe even the first year, I don't think that he really recognized that what he was doing was that far out of the norm until it really did start affecting, his ability to work. And we ended up finding out when he was going through treatment that he actually was also struggling with bipolar disorder. And so he would go through depressive episodes with that when the drinking would just really escalate because he was just not able to really function. And, then it would just be where he was completely off the rails at that point.
Did he ever tell you, said, "Yeah, I can stop drinking anytime"? Did he ever say that?
He tried. I don't really think he ever said, definitively that he knew that he could, but he would just tell me, that he was going to cut back, or that, he was planning to just like rein it in a little bit. And then every time he would attempt to do that, it would be unsuccessful.
Did he try to like hide the alcohol?
He did. So after a while, when it was bad in the evenings, when I would get home from work, and I had at that point, I was still in the corporate world and I had a management position that was really stressful. And so, I would come home and a lot of times come home to him already having had some drinks, and I would be not happy about that. So I felt like my entire day was stressful at work, and then my entire evening was stressful at home. And so we would have fights about it when I would get home. And I think kind of in an attempt to not have that happen, that he started drinking during the daytime when I was gone, which was, it went from bad to worse because it wasn't just at daytime and then cut it off. And now the night times are normal. It was now still the night times weren't good, but now, it was an issue in the daytime as well. So he was hiding it for a while for sure.
Did he ever try to figure out the triggers, the reason why he was drinking?
He did. In fact, he had, even way before it got so bad, he had he told me for years and years and years that he knew that there was something else wrong. And I just remember him saying that to me so many times. There's something else wrong. Like the drinking is just a symptom, and how I'm basically self-medicating what else is going on, which I can't figure out what that is. And he had looked into, being treated for depression and anxiety and things like that, but it had never really, none of the help that he ever received for any of that, none of the medications or doctors that he had seen had ever really been able to fix it to where he didn't feel like there was always that underlying problem. So he went more to go find help as to what else was going on instead of really finding help for the journey during that time.
I'm curious, because you at the beginning of when we started the show, you were saying that you drank socially. When he was going through all this, you knew there was a problem. How did you view drinking alcohol then?
So after that, it was a totally different thing. We weren't really going anywhere, doing anything socially anymore because our lives were pretty much in a shambles at that point because the drinking had affected everything. We were all just kind of hanging on by a thread by that point. So I definitely viewed it as an enemy when we got to that stage because I felt like it was taking my husband away. I felt like it was threatening my family. I felt like it was threatening my marriage. He had tried to take his life at two times during this whole thing, and so I, thought that it was literally going to end up taking my husband from me, and that my entire life was going to be affected and ruined by alcohol. So my views of it drastically changed after that, for sure.
Now, you had mentioned in one of your podcasts, you said something about um, if you thought your husband had a drinking problem or if you were oversensitive about the whole thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, at first, when I very first started, noticing that things were a little bit different, I thought, well, maybe it's just because I'm stressed out at work, and maybe I'm just coming home and it's just one more thing that I'm already kind of like at a 10 as far as being annoyed goes, and maybe I'm just coming home and just kind of like trying to pick a fight or trying to find a reason to be upset. And so I remember Googling, what are the signs of an alcoholic, like how do you know if your husband drinks too much, like all of those things, because I wasn't really sure at first if I was just kind of making a mountain out of a molehill or if it really was something that was problematic that we needed to look into a little bit further.
You know, for me, Julie, if I was in that situation, I'd do the exact same thing, and I would say, take my phone, to here, look at this. This is what it is.
Yeah.
This is who you are. Did you try to do that? Did like you saw something and try to say this is who you are?
Yeah, I would try to tell him, that I thought that there was a problem, but I know now that I did so many things wrong. I went about it the whole wrong way. Instead of going to him and really trying to have a heart when he was sober, I would kind of go after him when he was already inebriated and kind of like attack and just be like, oh my gosh, look, I told you, and just turn it into this whole big thing. And then, of course, at that point, he's on the defensive and I'm angry, and it just, there was no good communication at that point. But yeah, I did mention it to him, but I think that I probably did it in the wrong ways.
So this is kind of common, though, right? I mean, the situation's common for drinking, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a lot of times, when we find ourselves in that situation, you feel so helpless because it's somebody else that's doing it and you can't control it, but you feel like you need to control it to try to rein it in. And so that's a pattern that a lot of women fall into, definitely.
Um, you said you had a question in one of your podcasts. You had under the description, it says, "How much was too much?" What is? How do you answer that question?
I feel like, in a nutshell, if the drinking is affecting your life, and not meaning your, as just the wife, but if the drinking is affecting that person's life or your relationship or your kids, or if there's legal matters that have come up because of it, like a DWI or something like that, if the person's job is being affected, like if it's reaching out into your life more than just at the times that you're drinking, that's usually indicative that there is an issue over and above that. Also, if that person has tried to stop repeatedly and is unable to, that usually is also a red flag.
Now, did you find that you tried to, you said that your relationship, you didn't socialize as much anymore because you're fighting all the time. Did you find that you were comparing your husband to other people who were drinking as much?
I was actually, that was one of the things that when I was Googling it, I would think about friends, other friends that we had, other couples that we had, and I would think, well, so and so drinks, and he goes out to the bar a few times a week, and my husband never even did that. He always drank at home. He was never like a bar guy, but I would think, well, he does that, and he seems like everything's okay on his side, so maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe I'm just making too much of it. But then I realized, like, I didn't really know what was going on in that person's house. Maybe they were having the same trouble that we were. Maybe they were having the same fights that we were, but we wouldn't see that part of it, So I don't know that I was necessarily gauging what was quote unquote normal against what was truly normal, or, somebody else who had their own set of issues that they were dealing with.
I think, Julia, anybody who's listening or watching this, having you explain what you were going through and years of this, apparently up to, for quite some time, why didn't you just walk away and said, man, this just isn't worth it anymore?
There were a couple of reasons. The first thing was, well, there were really three main reasons. The first thing was, my husband is a good person. He's a great dad. He's a loving husband. I wouldn't have married him if I didn't think he was an awesome person. He's known as being like really laid back and just a really sweet guy, and he is. And so I knew that even though alcohol and addiction was taking over him and his personality and his life, essentially, that wasn't who he was, that was just something that he was doing, but it didn't really define him as a person. And I knew that he was still in there. So that was the big thing. The second thing was that he kept telling me there was something else wrong. And I had heard him say that so much. And even, he would tell me with tears in his eyes, there's something else wrong with me. Like, something is wrong in my head. I don't know what's going on. I've been trying to figure it out for years. And so that kind of desperation in his voice of just knowing that there really was kind of made me want to, help him fight and figure out, like, what is going on? What is the underlying reason here? And then the third reason why I didn't walk away, which is really what sustained me throughout all of it, even though I lost touch with it now and again, was my faith, because I am a person. I definitely had some times during that when I doubted God, and I was wondering if he was even real, and if he was, why were we being, subjected to this? And I definitely wasn't just like super strong in my faith through all of this, but it ultimately is what carried me through.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I fall back on a lot. When I go through a lot of challenges, and I have to say it's not in my hands anymore; it's in God's hands.
That's right.
And that's the hardest thing to admit, because you feel you want to have control over everything, and once you release that control, man, just the release that you have, the freedom that you have, says, it's not in my hands anymore; it's on you, God. Help me get through this. And I think that's so important in this kind of situation. Now, he said he had a problem and everything, and both of you obviously knew about all the organizations that can help other people. Why was it so difficult to engage in that and say, this is it, this is where we need to turn?
So he had tried on several occasions to just, go to AA meetings and things like that, and he said it never really did anything for him, because what he was dealing with, which we realized later, was bipolar disorder. You couldn't really kind of talk that away. There was something rooted, and he said that he would go and, he would go through the motions and listen to what they had to say, but at the end of the day, he would come home from the meeting, and whatever was going on in his head was still going on in his head, and it wasn't something that was changed. Of course, in his situation, he needed medication and ended up getting treatment for the bipolar in addition to getting treated for addiction, which I personally believe is probably the case for a lot of addicts. They just don't realize they have something underlying that's making it so difficult. But he had kind of, tried a few things like that, but it just was never enough.
Now, in one of your podcasts, you said something about the five most important things to do when you're dealing with a spouse's addiction. What are those five things?
So the first thing that I think is important is that you try to learn yourself about addiction, because there was so much that I didn't know. There is so much stigma around it and misunderstanding, and I carried a lot of that too. I thought that I was a person and they looked a certain way and they had a certain set of circumstances, and I thought wives of alcoholics, just picked the wrong person, or they just, weren't strong enough, or whatever the case. And it was just because of around the topic. Like, I didn't really know what he was going through. I thought that it was just 100% a choice, and that if he wanted to badly enough, he could just set it down and never pick it up again, which I now know is not true. And I just really think that it's super important for wives, especially because we have such a close relationship with our husband and we're in the same house. It's just really imperative that you learn about addiction for yourself so you can kind of understand what the person you love is dealing with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is learning about codependency, enabling, and all of the things that they talk about in organizations like Al-Anon. I didn't know what any of those things were. I had heard the terms tossed around, but I didn't know what they were as it relates to this particular situation. I didn't know I was doing all of them. I didn't know that I was doing everything wrong, and the things that I was doing that I thought were helping were actually hurting the situation. And so that's really kind of what I try to teach women now is you've got to understand the right ways to do things and the not so right things to do things, or way to do things, because you didn't cause it and you can't control it, but you can contribute to it based on how you're handling things. And in the long run, you are also hurting yourself and basically becoming addicted to the addiction. And now so that was something that happened to me. That is what I really, really want to spare my ladies from. That's no way to live. The third thing would be getting help for yourself. So in line with that is also, trying to just find a place, either Al-Anon or, somebody like me who can come alongside you and teach you what are the right ways, what mistakes did those of us who have already walked through it and seen our husbands through to sobriety, what are the things that we look back and we think, man, that was not how I should have handled that, So that's really important too, I think. The other thing is to find a trusted guide, a mentor. It could be a friend or a family member, somebody that you can really trust that is going to have be useful for you. You do have to be a little bit careful with that because you will run into a lot of really well-meaning advice that's not necessarily the best advice point in mind. But that's where places like Al-Anon and people like me who are recovery mentors can kind of be a sounding board for you and kind of let you know the right way to travel. So I think that's important too. And then I couldn't have done this without my faith. So I think that finding your faith and trying to just really, have as much faith with God as you can throughout this. I think that's just really important. Like I said, I wasn't perfect at that by any stretch, but ultimately it did really make a huge difference for me.
There's a question that came up. Do others tend to assume part of the blame in these situations?
Others meaning people outside of the particular. Yeah. Yes, I think so, because a lot of times, especially like as the wife or somebody who's in, you definitely tend to think, well, if I hadn't done this, then you wouldn't have done that, or other people outside of just your relationship, family members, sometimes parents, will have some blame that they put on themselves. And the fact of the matter is that the person who has the addiction is really the only person who can change it or fix it. You can have the best case scenario all around you, but until that person is ready, then they're not going to be successful with recovery. So we can blame ourselves all day, but at the end of the day, it is something that is ultimately their responsibility.
We're talking with Julie Sanford. She is the host of Married to Addiction podcast. And speaking of the podcast, you said, I thought this was really, really interesting because you said we should accept what we cannot change, detach with love, and create healthy boundaries. Now, when you're in the middle of this, obviously, it feels like it's impossible, right? So how do you answer that advice?
It really does feel impossible, and you kind of have to start with the way that I basically teach it is you kind of have to back up one step from just trying to change your behavior with what's going on in your mind first. Because if you are staying in the mindset and the mind frame where you are just constantly fixated on it and everything that's going wrong and just all of that, and that's all that you're thinking, then you're not really going to be in a place to really make healthy changes. So when I work with women, I back them up a step to really kind of try to get that in check first, because everything that we do starts with the thought, which usually turns into an emotion, which then turns into an action. So unless you back up to where you're dealing with, things that are running through your brain 24/7, and that going on because of that, it's going to be really hard to just change your behavior in a heartbeat and start doing things differently. So those things are really important, but you do need to kind of back it up a step and make sure that you're addressing what's up here as well.
Now, I'm curious because looking at the perspective of the person who's an alcoholic, is anyone really at fault other than the addict at times?
Like I said, you can't really control it or change it, but you can contribute to it. So what I mean by that is it's not my fault if he goes and drinks. Like ultimately he's the one who is making. I'm not like tying the bottle to his hand and forcing it in his mouth. So he ultimately is responsible for that. But just like with anything else, you can do things that help, or you can do things that could potentially hurt. So I think we have to be careful to understand that we're responsible for, but those are only the things that we can do and we can change. Ultimately, that person is the only one who is responsible for what they're doing to their own body.
I totally agree. Now, you also said you made a comment about how do you love the unlovable?
Mm-hmm. And that's a hard one. And I remember having a lot of feelings about my husband when we were going through this that I am not proud of. I mean, I used to mutter under my breath that I hated him, which it just makes my heart so sad now, because I didn't know that the things that he was going through. I didn't really understand the darkness that he was going through. And for me to just, basically act like it was him and he was doing that to me, that was the last thing that he wanted, was to be affecting our family like that. He was sick and he needed help. So I think that that's really one of the great things that having faith can do for you, because we get all kinds of examples of loving the unlovable from the Bible, and it's difficult, but I think a little mercy can go a really way in a situation like this.
So you have grown stepchildren, right?
I have 2 grown daughters that are mine, and that's from a previous marriage, and then me and my current husband have a son together. So
how did the rest of the family deal with the situation? Because obviously, it's not just you. I mean, the whole family was witnessing what was going on. How did that affect the dynamic of the family?
it was really hard, as you can imagine. My oldest daughter was already out of the house at that point, but my youngest daughter was here, and of course my young son was here, and it was very, I mean, just incredibly difficult. I did not do a good job of keeping them. I really wish that I would have. I did not make good choices as far as how to end, and they were witness to some things that I wish that they weren't. It was hard for all of us, but I also did have those conversations with my daughter. My son was really small at the time, so I really kind of helped him as shielded as I could. But I would tell my daughter the things that my husband was telling me, that something else was wrong, and that we needed to figure out what that was. He was really suffering and struggling, just to kind of explain to her how I was trying to be understanding on what he was going through, and she felt the same. We had a lot of anger towards him a lot of the time, but that was also kind of tempered by the fact that we were really worried for him, glad for him as well.
I don't want to, because right now we're looking at your perspective of the thing, and obviously your husband knows what's going on. He knows you're on this show, and I don't want to make him out to be the demon or the monster in this whole thing, because it's not the person, it's the alcohol that kind of puts in that kind of situation. So I want to make it clear that we're not trying to demean your husband, because it's not necessary. But the thing that you talked about, and this is one of the things I really liked about one of your podcasts. You talked about the difference between detachment and emotional abandonment in the podcast. Can you explain the difference between that?
Yeah, that was a really hard one for me. I didn't understand how, because that detachment was one of the things that I heard about from out old to me at the time. I was thinking to myself, how am I supposed to detach from this person who needs me more now than he ever has? You know, that just felt so mean to just say, okay, well, you're on your own. What I didn't realize at the time is you're not detaching from the person and emotionally abandoning them. You're detaching from the addiction and your obsession with the addiction and being yourself being controlled by the addiction and the enabling and all of those things that we find ourselves, the patterns that we find ourselves in. You're detaching from that. You're detaching from letting his every action, every time he takes a drink personally affect you and just put you back into a state of mental turmoil. Those are the things that we're detaching from because that's not healthy to live that way. It's not going to be easy to be in the situation regardless, but if you are constantly just fixated on that and obsessing with that and having it rule your life, that's what can really become dangerous. And so you can detach from those things without feeling like you're only cutting off from your spouse.
So what does that actually look like when you're detaching? Like, explain what like a typical day would be trying to detach when he's going through whatever he's going through in that day.
So for me, and again, I did not get very good at this until really late in the game, which is what I try to help people with now. But for me, before it would just be where I was just thinking about what he was doing every hour of every day. I would leave work sometimes if I was worried that he might be drinking. I ended up covered in patches of stress-induced hives for months on end because I had so much stress about being just constantly fixated on that. I would search for alcohol. I would dump out alcohol. I would follow him. I mean, just everything. Like my life just revolved around his drinking and how can I fix it and how can I control it. When I finally detached, I finally started realizing, okay, me doing that is not changing anything but how I feel. Less. It's not making him, see and understand that he needs recovery. It's not helping anyone in this house. It's just making me absolutely miserable. So that's when I had to start trying to practice, like I said, moving back a couple of steps. And when those thoughts would come into my mind and the obsession with it, just kind of try to shut it down and stop it from turning into going and getting in the car and going, to see if he was where I thought he was, or going to search through his vehicle, or to search through his closet, those types of things. So it was just really stopping myself when it just was a thought before it went to the emotion to where I was just completely wrapped up in it again.
Yeah, but finally you got to that breaking point. You talked about this. Your tipping point was in the shower. Can you explain what happened that particular time?
Yes, I remember that so clearly. At that point, I really didn't know what else to do. I felt like I had tried everything. I felt like I had done everything. I had threatened and screamed and, tried to control and tried to fix, and just nothing was changing. In fact, things were getting worse. And like I said, my husband tried to take his life twice at this point. And taking a shower one day and I turned the water on like as hot as I could stand it because I was just mad. And I had been going back and forth with my relationship with God. Like, was he even real? Why wasn't he showing up? And I just basically started screaming at the top of my lungs. It wasn't like, a holy crying out to God. It was like he's screaming at God, help us. Help us. Like, you got to show up. I have nothing left. We are falling apart. My husband's going to die probably. My marriage just feels like it's over. My kids are suffering. I just remember feeling absolutely like I just had nothing left. And after that day, things started to shift, and I started noticing that, it felt lighter, first of all. And it was not very long after that where my husband did agree to go to treatment. And it was almost like God was waiting for me to get out of the way in some ways, because my voice in my husband's ear was so loud and so often that I don't think that God could even work in his life or in his spirit because I was too busy being here all the time, And I felt like that day was just kind of really a turning point where I just gave it up and gave it over, like you were talking about earlier, just like releasing that control, because I just felt like I couldn't handle it anymore. And nothing I was doing was working anyway. So that was really the point where I just started to experience relief on my side. And then, of course, when he agreed to go to treatment, it was a whole different story.
So when you said he agreed to it, did he know what went on in the shower?
I didn't talk to him specifically about that until after the fact, but he, he just finally told me that he was ready to go. And so we made an appointment he only committed to 2 weeks, 2 week outpatient, 2 week inpatient at first. But he said, I'll go to this 2 week thing. And so we went there, and it was not a pretty scene. He showed up drunk to the place and tried to leave, and it was not good. The whole thing was just not good. But he did end up staying there, and he ended up doing a medical detox there at that facility for 2 weeks. And then he was transferred to another facility about an hour and a half away. That was a dual diagnosis facility that treated him for the bipolar and the addiction. He was there for 30 days. So it was, all told, it was about 6 weeks of him being in inpatient treatment. And then he did outpatient after that too. But really the inpatient treatment was the thing that really made the difference.
Now, was that the most intense therapy that he had previous to that? I mean, because so this is more involved with it, obviously, but
yeah, for sure.
Did you have the kind of feeling, okay, we've done this before, why is this one going to work?
I was very hopeful because of the dual diagnosis. When they first started talking about how they gave him the diagnosis of bipolar, and it was just almost like, oh my gosh, that's the thing, thinking about that's been underlying. So I felt really hopeful after that, because now I felt like, okay, well, they're not just going to teach him how to not drink, which is great. And, for some people, that's all the recovery that they need. But for him, when it was a self-medication issue, for them to not address what was underlying would have been helpful, because he probably would have just got right back out and had the same feelings he was having before and gone right back to it. So I did feel really helpful, because it was that kind of like the double thing. They were treating both sides of the issue.
When he came out of it, what was his demeanor? How did things change for him then?
It was a little weird for the first few weeks. He was quiet, and that's normal. He was trying to live a completely different life than he'd been living for a couple of years, and he had a lot more money, and he had medication, and so all of those things were in his favor. But being in treatment where you're completely immersed into that recovery life, and you don't have access to alcohol, and you're there only focusing on your treatments, you don't have to worry about family, work, like any of that, and then going back to the real world and the same opportunities that you had before and the same environment you were in before, it was hard. And so he felt a lot better, obviously, because he now was armed with a lot of different things that he didn't have before. But I remember the first few weeks he was just really quiet, and we just kind of gave him his space and understood that he was an adjustment.
Now, when I first started talking about bringing you on and my personal experience with what's going on with my family, there's always like triggers that happen. And with this person, his son passed away through an overdose, and that was his trigger. That was his trigger to say, I can't deal with this anymore. And this has been 4 years of recovery. I mean, have you ever been concerned that there might be that trigger that would put him over the edge again?
I do worry about that sometimes, not as much now as before, but he still has hard days like we all do, and he still has some times where I think that he does, probably way more stable than it was, but I still see signs of that sometimes, where he just seems like he is really kind of funky and just way more down than usual. And so I do worry about that sometimes, but I think that it's, now that I know what I know, I feel like we would be way better equipped to deal with that if there was some sort of a relapse issue, because we know what we're dealing with now, we know we have the tools that we we learned through treatment and all of that. So even though I am concerned about that, and that would obviously be devastating, I don't feel as hopeless about that as I would have had it happen prior.
Well, now you have the tools, to how to handle it or how not to handle it at the same time.
Absolutely. Right.
So you, at some point, you decided, it's not just about me anymore. It's about letting other people know who are going through the same kind of situation. But you started to made the decision to start the podcast. Why did you start to do that?
So I was very reluctant at first. I felt like my story was supposed to be shared, and I felt like I definitely had some hope to bring to people, but I didn't want to talk about it because it's not a fun subject and it's not a pretty subject, and it's hard to relive those times that my family went through. But then I started kind of seeing these signs of how I needed me when I was going through what I was going through. And I was looking for me now, the person who had been through it, walked through it. Their marriage was, restored and still intact. They found a happy life at the end of it. They made it through whole. And I couldn't really find that. And decided that, well, that's really nice that there's people out there that need that, but I don't want to talk about it. I'm not comfortable with that. It's pretty dang selfish. So I kind of got a little convicted on that and started thinking about it from my perspective of, how would I have felt if I knew that there was somebody that could help me back then, but just chose not to. And it didn't feel right. So at that point, I decided to move forward with the platform and the podcast and all of that.
Well, that's good. What kind of response have you gotten so far?
Really great. I mean, I kind of felt like at the beginning, if I could just help one person, it would still be worth it. And I've had several women either leave a review on my podcast or reach out to me via email. I have a membership group now where I help ladies, and just hearing them really being helped by and encouraged by what I went through it makes it all worth it.
Well, that's good. Now that for people who are listening and watching this show, you can check out how do people find out about you're married to an addict or married to addiction. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm pretty much married to addiction everywhere. So that's my podcast name. That's my website, marriedtoaddiction.com. That's my handle on all the social media channels, and I'm pretty much everywhere as that. So I would love for them to look me up if this is something that resonates with them or maybe could help somebody they know. I do have an online program and also a membership where I group coach ladies who are going through this too. And I'd be happy to help and honored to help in whatever way that I could.
Well, Julie, I hope that what we talked about tonight is going to help at least just one person, and I'm pretty sure it will because this show is worldwide, and I'm sure that there are people going through the same thing with their husband or wife. It's not just for wives. It's also about husbands who might be going through the same kind of situation.
Yeah.
But I think you're a great help. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I just, if this is something that does resonate with you, to get help for yourself. I waited way too long and I suffered a lot of consequences from that. And I think that my family did too, unfortunately. So I know that it feels weird to reach out for help when you feel like you're not necessarily the one that has the problem. But I can tell you from experience, if you don't, you will probably end up being the one with the problem as well. So it's just so important.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on my show, Julie. And I want to end with something that I just connected with today. I want to read it as my parting note for people. It's called Just for Tonight. Just for tonight, I will be grateful. I will give thanks for the past day, its failures as well as its successes, its sadness as well as its joy, and its pain as well as its pleasure. I will take comfort in knowing that every event and circumstance that occurred today can be used for my good and the good of others. Just for tonight, I will accept that I have done the best I could, remembering that my goal is spiritual progress and not perfection. I will let go of my expectation I had for this day, as well as any disappointment, shame, or guilt I have felt from not being perfect today. Just for tonight, I will be humble. I will give my shortcomings to a power greater than myself, trusting that doing so can bring about changes in me that I could not bring about myself. Just for tonight, I will not attempt to rectify today's mistakes or solve tomorrow's problems. I'll remind myself that I am better able to receive guidance when my mind and body are rested and refreshed. And just for tonight, I will set aside my fears, frustrations, and aspirations, and take a few minutes to review the abundance that exists in my life today. I will place my future in the care of a loving God of my own understanding, trusting my needs will be met at a time and in a way that is best for all concerned. I think that whole thing is appropriate, don't you think, Julie?
Yes, absolutely. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think it spoke to me. It spoke to me.
I'm going to look that up. I love that.
Yeah, I found it on Pinterest. Look
Oh,
for
nice.
look for al-anon, and you'll see that in there. But it's really impactful.
Yeah, for sure.
So as I end all my shows, I want everyone to smile infectiously, laugh genuinely, love unconditionally, and live courageously. I believe in all of you, and I hope that next week is going to be the best week of your life, and some things are going to change. Holy cow, was that the thunderstorm out there?
It was. It just started. I'm sorry.
Good timing. At least
I saw the lightning and thought, oh no, here it comes.
at least it wasn't a dog barking, And
That's true. True.
yeah, I've had that before, but that's okay. So anyway, I'd like to have everyone to enjoy the rest of your week. And when you feel that you're struggling, you have a higher power that's going to help you get through your situation. But you have to have faith. You have to have belief that it's not just in your hands; it's in God's hands as well. So have a great week, folks.